Okay, well, I'd like to welcome everybody to today's honors program, Summer School of Complexity Special Engagement event. Today we're going to have a Gray Matters and Complex Systems seminar on the topic of complexity and philosophy. Our guest speaker today is Professor Dorothea Olkowski. Dorothea Olkowski is currently the director of the Humanities program at UCCS, also the director of the Cognitive Studies minor. She loves contemporary 20th century continental philosophy, especially Bergson, Merleau-Ponty, and Deleuze, and has had a number of national and international fellowships. She is the author/editor of 13 books and over 100 articles, including Deleuze and Guattari's Philosophy of Freedom, Freedom's Refrains. That's a Routledge book, 2019. And this book here, excellent recent book called Deleuze, Bergson, Merleau-Ponty, The Logics and Pragmatics of Affect, Perception, and Creation. That came out on Indiana University Press just about a year and a half ago. Today's talk is going to be focusing on complex nonlinear systems, and we're going to be learning about the background, the scientific and maybe mathematical background behind those types of systems, and then perhaps discussing some of the ways in which that relates to or connects with philosophy and some of the other disciplines that we may be interested in. So I'd like to welcome Professor Dorothea Olkowski. Welcome.
Thank you, Joseph, for being here, and thank you, Dr. Sumwell, for inviting me, and Carol for everything you do for this program. It's really exemplary, all of you. Well, I'm going to say a few words, and then I'm going to show you a part of a video, not all of it, from a scientist whose work I greatly admire and who has strongly affected the way I understand complexity. I want to say that I think I've been working with the idea of complex systems probably since I was a graduate student, but I wouldn't have been aware of that term. It did exist at that time, but I wasn't aware of it, nor of the many scientists, philosophers, and others who were engaged with what became complexity theory. My first introduction to the science of complexity actually came, oh, Siri wants to talk to me, that's horrible. Siri, go away. Because I'm looking at another screen for my paper. My first introduction came from a mathematician, John Castee. Wonderful book, Complexification, Explaining a Paradoxical World Through the Science of Surprise. With Castee introduces us to many ideas: catastrophe, chaos, lawlessness, irreducibility, emergence, and surprise. But he begins with a simple question of whether our language accurately reflects reality. I mean, for example, when I say go to the desk or go to the counter, these statements, which use short and simple terms, seem pretty clear. But even Ludwig Wittgenstein, that philosophical master of the logical structure of language, eventually came to the conclusion that speaking is hopeless, and only pointing to what you mean by the table or the counter can clear up the confusion intrinsic to language. So when I say desk, I could be referring to the flat surface in the kitchen where I occasionally work when I say counter, or I could be referring to some ad hoc table sitting in a corner where I keep some supplies, or even the app on my phone that keeps track of the number of steps I take each day. So additionally, we might ask, what is the meaning of the word to? I'm sorry, I am a philosopher. We might ask about the logical structure between language and the world, because it's never as clear as we assume. And it's not only ordinary language that suffers from this. If, for instance, we look at the mathematical proof 1 + 1 = 2, the philosophers Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead's Principia Mathematica developed this, we are always surprised that it takes over 360 pages to resolve this question. Acclaimed as a work of geniuses, this book, the light shining on it dimmed somewhat when Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem revealed that mathematical proofs cannot be both consistent and complete. These discrepancies become even more problematic when we're trying to make predictions about the future based on past states of the world and the models developed to explain them, especially since this is the business of science by means of rule following leading to formalization. One such set of rules, as described by Casti, is called a dynamical system in mathematics. If you've ever played the game Treasure Hunt, and most children have played it in some version, you know the rules. It's called the vector field in mathematics. Beginning from an initial state, players start at different locations and they move from location to location on a pathway, a trajectory, guided by instructions or clues given to them at each location. The end point, where the winner finds a prize, is called an attractor, and it governs the motion of the entire game. I mean, who would play if there was nothing attracting them, after all? Fixed point attractors, as they are called, are definite areas of attraction, such as the point where the winner finds the prize. If the game's creator were a bit devious, they might set up another attractor called a limit cycle and send one or even all of the players in a fruitless round of movement, retracing their steps over and over and over. Not very much fun, but fixed. Outside of this, however, something else can occur. The devious game maker can give one player a particular initial condition or starting point whose rules are repeated at each point, but each repetition cannot be carried out precisely as directed. This initial condition creates a trajectory, a path, that sends the player on a route that amounts to a tangled mess in which that poor player passes by all the others over and over, endlessly cycling through the game space without ever repeating the exact same trajectory, pathway, to the point where they are confused and lost, unsure where to go and totally unstable. They've been dealt a strange attractor, as it's called, and so they go on and on and on with no end in sight, zombified. They endlessly follow the rules from point to point, but they never reach the prize. This sensitivity to initial conditions and the existence of strange attractors occurs all the time as the rule and not the exception. But has our poor player really been abandoned to wander randomly, or could something else have occurred? Let's suppose our player has a fixed trajectory, but has noticed that other players are following very different kinds of stable pathways, leading them through what appear to be nicer parts of the park. That player might just abandon their own pathway and follow another player. But even then, there could be a problem if the player can't decide between two different but equally enticing paths through the woods of two other different players. Stretched between them, so to speak, the player becomes unstable until undergoing a catastrophe, falling out into a new stable situation called a manifold, most likely falling out of the game and going home. Who can blame them? These simplifications of complex mathematical ideas nonetheless give us insight into how easily processes become chaotic or unstable. But we haven't yet examined the process by which the player may leave this state of chaos and enter a new system, a new order, or a new organization, the one we call complexity. In the example above, the game has rules, so it is what we call deterministic. It follows rules. But chaotic systems generate random behavior by means of deterministic rules. Unfortunately, even mathematicians argue that chaos is a tricky thing to define. The world-famous website, Wolfram Math World, notes that none of the chaos scientists interviewed by James Gleick for his book called Chaos were able to agree on a definition, so he relied on several descriptions for his website. The simplest of these for our purposes is the following. Quote, the very use of the word chaos implies some observation of a system, perhaps through measurement, and these observations or measurements vary unpredictably. We often say that observations are chaotic when there's no discernible regularity or order. Well, to this somewhat circular definition, we might want to add that by a chaotic solution to a deterministic equation, a set of given rules, we mean a solution whose outcome is very sensitive to initial conditions. And this adds a new term, initial conditions. Small changes in initial conditions lead to eventual very great differences. And sensitivity to initial conditions have an evolution that appears to be quite random. Minimally, then, chaos in mathematical terms is a study of complex, nonlinear dynamic systems. But if our subject is complexity, then why are we wasting time explaining chaos? The nonlinear systems we've been talking about so far are linguistic and mathematical. And they fascinate us insofar as their input and output are incommensurate. They don't match up. A great deal of attention has been given to these types of nonlinear systems, and they've been described or characterized even by those who are not linguists or mathematicians. Nevertheless, it's been noted frequently that many natural systems that are thermodynamically open to new matter and energy are non-equilibrium systems, and their evolutionary processes of emergence and development are nonlinear. We'll explain this in more detail in a little bit. A whirlpool fed by a constant stream of water in a bathtub or at the bottom of a natural falls reveals this process very clearly. This brings us out of the linguistic and mathematical and a bit more in the direction of nature, and it opens the way towards a slightly clearer understanding of complexity. A great deal of amplification of these questions came from the Nobel laureate Ilya Prigogine in the book Order Out of Chaos, Man's New Dialogue with Nature, which was co-written with a philosopher of science, Isabelle Stengers, Belgian philosopher of science. And Prigogine and Isabelle Stengers argue that if, quote, in the classical view, the basic processes of nature were considered to be deterministic, set, and reversible, today we see everywhere the rule of irreversible processes, that is, of fluctuation. So in classical science, at least on the subatomic or level, in principle, all processes are reversible. But the classical model does not take into account sensitivity to initial conditions, which we mentioned very briefly above. The reality that even two very close together initial conditions will follow very different pathways. But insofar as there's only one universe given to us, we don't really have a way to test this on a cosmological scale. And yet, in our environment, we see no evidence for our region of the universe being a low entropy fluctuation in a static world in equilibrium. We don't see this meltdown. Instead, we see a universe evolving in time with structure on every scale developing as the universe expands. So Prigogine and Stengers reformulate the world as an open system, complex, probabilistic, irreversible in time, particularly as it applies to the macroscopic scale, the scale of atoms, molecules, and biomolecules. And this came out of the conclusion that new dynamic states of matter may emerge from the thermal chaos, the chaos we were talking about at the beginning. When a system interacts with its surroundings, here's one example. On Jupiter, the great red spot, which is a vortex on the planet Jupiter, you can check it out, which has continued for centuries. These new structures were given the name of dissipative structures to indicate that dissipation can in fact play a constructive role in the formation of new states. So Prigogine and Stengers argue that the equilibrium balance structures of thermodynamics don't account for various structures encountered in nature. So once again, we're headed towards nature. Once formed, equilibrium structures may be isolated and maintained without interaction from the environment. So, picture a closed box where all the molecules eventually settle down because there's nothing inciting them to movement. By contrast, biological cells, or cities for that matter, are open systems, feeding matter and energy of the world, without which they would die off. Prigogine and Stengers ask how it's possible for living, organized beings endowed with sensations to exist in an inert world. Opposed to this, far from equilibrium systems, are instances of the threshold where fluctuations lead to unstable behavior. Now, this actually is not that new of an idea. The Roman poet and philosopher Lucretius, 99 to 55 BCE, called this the clinamen, and he described it as a spontaneous, unpredictable deviation that describes turbulence. And we've all witnessed turbulence, especially here in Colorado. You go for a hike and you see these rushing, melting streams of snow streaming into turbulent streams and waterways. Turbulence was for a long time dismissed as just noise, but long after Lucretius, turbulence was actually recognized as macroscopically chaotic, but on the microscopic level, coherent and highly organized. This transition from the macroscopic, which is our, what we might be seeing if we're on that walk, to the microscopic, from what appears to be merely chaotic to something that's highly organized and coherent behavior, from stable flows to turbulence to coherence, is now viewed as self-organization. And it's evidence for what the computer science Christopher Langton called complexity at the edge of chaos. Thus, in Langton's really excellent analyses and many, many years of work, complexity always appears at the edge of chaos. When a system interacts with the outside world, exchanging energy and matter, these non-equilibrium conditions may be the setting for what Prigogine and Stengers call dissipative structures that don't exhibit the characteristics of mere energy loss, but actually become sources of order out of chaos. That's the title of their book. And as they point out, this process has become apparent in molecular biology. Quote, imagine a situation in which chemical or other reaction produces an enzyme whose presence then encourages further production of the same enzyme. Autocatalysis, it's called. And this is prevalent in a small number of basic biomolecules and helps to explain how lumps of DNA develop into complex living organisms. Of course, this only occurs for molecules that are highly complex and specific, that have a specific past, and that have evolved to take part in these autocatalytic processes. Molecular biology explains the transmission and exploitation of genetic feedback loops, nonlinear processes, although because living systems are complex, not every reaction is alive in the sense described above. And Prigogine and Stengers describe living systems as resembling the flow of a generally smooth river that from time to time tumbles down a waterfall. And it is this tumble that liberates part of its energy for use. And this leads us to the question of whether there are other objective ways to characterize complexity. So this might be a good moment to stop and to show you a little bit of this wonderful video from Stuart Kaufman, an evolutionary biologist who has one of the founders at the Santa Fe Institute on Studies on Complexity. Hopefully I'll be able to get this screen up here and show you a little bit of it.
We see that.
You see it?
Mm-hmm.
Good. Thank you for the
confirmation.
Please put your hands together. Welcome.
That's not it, though.
To the stage, Peter Godfrey.
That's not the right one. It's not.
Okay.
It's not what I had queued up. Things always happen, don't they?
Talk will be a fast.
I was just hoping I could just reverse it. Hang on. I might be in. Just give me a second, and I will put it up. I have a backup plan. There we go. Let's hope that this is it.
Can you make it bigger?
Once upon a time, around 4 billion years ago, on the edge of Guandaland lay a sleepy lagoon. Patrick, Rupert, Sly, and Gus lived in the water with the other protocells. They floated around feeding on stuff. Nobody got much stuff because everything moved at the same speed. So stuff was hard to catch, but nobody got mad either. Patrick was a game kid. One day, he felt a pinch, and a molecule popped out of his side like a growth, a peptide made of 13 amino acids. He was floating near a rock, and the peptide stuck to it. Patrick tugged and wiggled, but couldn't break free, and realizing he could no longer float, wondered how he'd eat. Patrick looked up and saw stuff floating by. Because he was no longer moving, stuff came to him and he got more. Patrick ate hungrily, then once again felt strange. The stuff's nutrients helped him to divide into two Patricks. It happened again and again, so that eventually there was a patch of Patricks stuck to the rocks, with stuff for everyone. What had happened? Patrick had become the first sessile filter feeder on the Earth and started a colony. Imagine, a protocell from nowhere. He'd made something of himself. However, accidentally, getting stuck was an opportunity. And now stuff came to everyone in the Patrick patch. What does Patrick's story tell us about the becoming of the universe? It shows that opportunities only exist if there's something that can seize it, for whom it's an advantage. Opportunity doesn't sit there waiting. There's a coming together, a context, which brings the for whom and the opportunity together. Patricks came to exist in the space we call the biosphere because they were autopoietic, self-reproducing systems. Or as Charles Darwin could have said, an early form of life able to evolve by heritable variation and natural selection. All it had taken was for Patrick to get stuck to a rock. Darwin called this pre-adaptation. Meanwhile, back in the lagoon, Rupert, like Patrick, wiggled around looking for stuff. He was a tough guy, and if he bumped into other guys, he could feed by making a hole in them and sucking out their insides. But it didn't happen very often because everybody floated at the same speed. One day, Rupert floated towards the Patrick patch. He bumped into a Patrick, poked a hole in him, and ate him. From that day on, he became known as Rupert Raptor, the first predator on the Earth. He now only ate Patrick's. His nutrition improved, and he also divided. Soon there were lots of Ruperts in the Patrick patch, which was also growing fast. What does Rupert's story tell us about the becoming of the universe? Well, he created the first food chain in the biosphere. He was also someone for whom there was an opportunity. He could feed on stuff and other protocells, but it was easier to eat Patrick's stuck to rocks. Patrick's provided the context for Rupert's opportunity. And by seizing it, other Ruperts came to exist and feed on the colonies of Patrick's, which also grew in numbers. The lagoon's ecosystem now included protocells, floating stuff, Patrick patches, and Ruperts grazing on Patrick's. Pythagoras taught that everything is number. But can you write an equation for this evolution? Can mathematics help? No. The story is all you need to know. However, the story doesn't end there. Sly, who liked to look cool,
Am I back?
Yes, we can.
You can hear me? Thank you. Okay. Needless to say, the story goes on. So let me kind of make a frame around it, and then I'll go back to Stuart Kaufman himself and his wonderful work. You notice the very last thing he said is, you can't write an equation for this. And yet I'm talking about mathematics, right? So this seems to be a bit contradictory. So John Casti, looks at this and he contrasts complex systems with simple systems with predictable behavior. And as Kaufman points out, none of the behavior of these protocells was predictable. It happened to be as he says, right, something or someone for whom, and the opportunity, the situation. Few components, interaction, feedback, or forward loops, few variables, centralized decision-making, and weak interactions among components, which may be missing or replaceable. By contrast, so those are the predictable systems. By contrast, complex systems display unpredictable and surprising acausal behavior, in part due to the multiplicity of variables and feedback loops, the diffusion of authority, there was no top-down structure here, and irreplaceable components, Rupert, Sly, and the others to come who follow them. With time, the analysis of the characteristics of complex systems has become more sophisticated. Previously, we talked about sensitivity to initial conditions, and you can see there was that sensitivity to initial condition, that the initial circumstance of sticking to the rock and getting more food. And this implies that minor uncertainties, error, or disturbances can amplify into large subsequent uncertainties with respect to location and direction. Mathematically, we say we can refer to this as symmetry breaking, which occurs, for example, you can replicate this yourselves, by simply heating water in a pan on a stove. It breaks the random profile of molecules vertically as the bottom layers heat up and pass the heat upward to the cooler layers, breaking the original symmetry of the liquid through conduction. Increasing the heat to full boil further breaks this form through convection. In each symmetry, breaking the orderedness and complexity of the system is increased. And symmetry breaking transitions are assumed to account for the order and complexity in the universe. Complex systems bifurcate. That's what happened to Sly and Rupert. Due to structural instability, for example, the transition of liquid to gas, again in our ordinary experience, or solid to liquid, so you don't have to go back to the origins of life, is called a phase transition. There's a famous case of the collapse of 3 balconies in a Kansas City hotel, with unfortunately loss of life that occurred due to an engineering change in the placement of the nuts supporting the balconies that tripled the load on one of them, causing it to split open and the balconies to collapse. Bifurcation is a condition for self-organization as the system moves to a form that is either ordered and or more complex. Now, Prigogine emphasizes that there is a bifurcation, a deterministic description, that when there's a bifurcation, deterministic description breaks down. So these Gus and Sly floating around in this pool, right? The situation breaks down, and instabilities that are the result of fluctuations may be localized in a small part of the system and spread from there, leading to new macroscopic states, such as the collapse of the balconies that I just described. Apparently, the occurrence of such an instability was not foreseen or foreseeable in the case of the Kansas City Hotel. But when a system bifurcates sufficiently, but under its own dynamics, self-organization can be realized, and that's what Kaufman is describing, such as also the heated pan I described above, whose contents shift from conduction to convection. One often hears theorists from various disciplines referring to surprising interactions as emergence. It's another popular term, but this word could apply to many situations that don't necessarily involve the system's own dynamics. But perhaps it's too late to confine that term to self-organized systems alone. Where does all this order come from? The answer depends, of course, on who's asking the questions. Among those scientists and philosophers who've asked those, the one who interests me greatly, one of many, is Stuart Kaufman. A little bit of his video I just showed you. He trained as a medical doctor, but he became a theoretical biologist and an early member of the Santa Fe Institute's Complexity Project. And for Kaufman, the answer to this question begins, as he said, with Darwin and with natural selection. But for Darwin, of course, natural selection was largely accidental, whereas for Kaufman, the laws of complexity themselves generate spontaneous order, after which natural selection refines and molds the situation. The second law of thermodynamics proposes that the universe itself is moving in the direction of greater disorder, driven by entropy. Yet, as Kaufman argues, we are surrounded by extraordinary surges towards order. And he writes that, quote, the biosphere around us sustains us, is created by us, grasps the energy flux from the sun into the great web of biochemical, biological, geologic, economic, and political exchanges that envelop the world. Kaufman grounds this in two basic conditions. One, the reality that any small change in a chaotic system can and typically does have large amplifying effects. And two, quantum mechanics, which ensures the fundamental indeterminism of particles at the subatomic level. Moreover, there's the universe, the non-equilibrium universe, filled, as he notes, with too many hydrogen and helium atoms as opposed to iron, which is the most stable atom. And beyond that, the clusters of galaxies on many scales that comprise a universe with abundant free energy available for work. With regard to the question of the origin and nature of life, Prigogine and Stengers, as well as Kaufman, cite the philosopher who's perhaps most influenced my work in this area, the Polish, I lost my page, sorry, Polish-French philosopher named Henri Bergson. I accidentally backed up, let me find where I was. There we go. For many years, the scientific community overlooked or outright condemned Bergson under the influence of criticism levied against him by Bertrand Russell, who strongly opposed Bergson's prioritization of geometry over logic, just one area. Russell said Bergson's philosophy was a dualist opposition between life and matter, derived from the distinction Bergson drew between the tendencies, not opposites, of instinct or intuition and those of intellect. And Bergson insists that each of these tendencies includes some aspect of the other, so they aren't opposites at all. Since for Bergson, time as duration, which is what he calls it, and change arise with instinct or intuition, intuition does not separate the world into distinct entities, while space as intellect does precisely this. Interestingly, Kaufman cites Bergson for what is called vitalism, the idea that has been perhaps overplayed and to some extent misrepresented, distorted, by the drive to reduce biological phenomena to physical ones at the expense of self-organization. Bergson's target was always determinism. His version of novelty requires heterogeneity, or multiplicity without divisibility and succession without separation, heterogeneity, he calls it, rather than distinct separation between entities. Qualitative multiplicity, another term. But he says the problem is that the causal order of the classical sciences doesn't take time into account. Prigogine and Stengers also pick this up, citing Bergson's critique of scientific rationality, precisely for its reduction of time and change to a sequence of instantaneous separate states linked by deterministic laws. For Bergson, time is invention, and nature, like for Kaufman, is change, the continued elaboration of the new, open to development without a pre-established model. By contrast, according to Bergson, physics is bent on detaching events from the whole, taking them up as abstractions, like individual frames used to create the illusion of movement in film. And this is one reason why, Kaufman ended this little thing I showed you. If we have time, we can go back and see a little more, with the idea that this is not a mathematical equation. And one of the reasons that so many people who are computer scientists have been interested in this is that they're trying to model complexity because they don't have algorithms for it. So they want, sort of computer simulations, if you will, to model what happens in complexity. For Prigogine and Stengers, Bergson's criticisms might have to be addressed by studying the limitations of classical dynamics and discovering new formulations. Certainly, this is their goal, as it is Kaufman's. And he argues that Hans Driesch, a brilliant experimentalist, came to similar conclusions as Bergson by separating frog embryos into two and discovering that each cell developed into a fully normal frog. Rather than falling back, like Gus, rather than falling back on the already discredited theory of homunculi, 19th century theory, the idea that preformed entities somehow nested inside the egg, Driesch surmised that there must be information making this possible in each cell, and that the order in question is emergent. As we saw in the brief segment I showed you, Kaufman argues that life is a natural property of complex chemical systems, a position Bergson also maintained. That is, that so-called dead molecules organize if each molecule's formation is catalyzed by some other. Thus, when the number of different kinds of molecules in the chemical soup passes a certain threshold, called an autocatalytic metabolism, that is a self-sustaining network of reactions, which we started to see in the video, will appear, and life emerges complex and whole. What is remarkable here is the claim that this is not Watson-Crick pairing. It's not a double helix, but it is something actually deeper and something simpler, based in chemistry and originating with dead molecules, Kaufman's word. For Bergson, change arises within myriad complex interactions along successive states. Evolution, he argues, doesn't follow a single course, but fragments like a shell, bursting from a cannon, and each fragment bursts again and again. Life meets resistance from inert matter, but as he writes, it succeeds by dint of humility, making itself very small and very insinuating, bending to physical and chemical forces, consenting even to go a part of the way with them. Thus, Kaufman's excellent video demonstration of this. Thus, initially, it might have been difficult to say whether the simplest forms of life were physical and chemical or living. But the animate forms that first appeared, he insists, were of extreme simplicity, tiny masses of scarcely differentiated protoplasm. Yeah, I lost my page again. It's the problem with an iPad. If you touch the wrong the wrong place, you get the wrong place on the screen. Sorry about that. So, yet such organized matter quickly reaches a threshold and divides instead of growing. The extent to which Bergson's speculation about the origin of life proved to be precisely those of Kaufman Kaufman's discovering can be debated, but the fact remains that, as Bergson insists, the evolution of life is a tendency creating divergent directions in time, heterogeneous and surprising, and adapting itself to accidents of the ground and not the realization of a plan. So to complete this account, let's just say a little more about complexity itself. Kaufman argues that the reason complex systems exist on or in the ordered regime near the edge of chaos is because evolution takes them there. Natural selection, as Bergson said, tunes their parameters until they arrive at the region between order and chaos, where complex behavior lives. In terms strangely reflective of Bergson's, Kaufman states that if life arose as collectively autocatalytic sets, then the first life was already exploding and struggling to control the explosion. This supercriticality, Kaufman calls it, continues until limited by factors such as food supply and energy, but also by the fact that we metabolize our food rather than simply merging with it. For life, Kaufman asserts, oh dear. For life, Kaufman asserts, I'm sorry, I've done that again. Kaufman cites several limitations to natural selection, even with the assistance of mutation. One is that living things mutate too slowly and remain trapped at a certain optimum, or they mutate too fast and fail due to increasing poor fitness, an error catastrophe, not unlike what was described earlier with the falling of the balconies. Hence, self-organization is the essential precondition of evolution. So let's conclude by taking this very briefly into an area that's extremely relevant to my work, the physiology of perception. And I'm just going to mention this very briefly. Much of my philosophical research is grounded in Bergson's analysis of affectivity and cognition, as well as the phenomenology of perception of the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who spent a number of years working in a psychology research lab to ground his idea, Rat Lab. I have written many papers and parts of my books on these two, so in the interest of moving forward, I'm going to refer to a more recent neurobiologist, Walter Freeman. Freeman concludes, based on 30 years of research, that perception can't be understood as the activity of individual neurons, the common approach in neuroscience. Rather, perception requires the simultaneous cooperative activity of millions of neurons spread throughout expanses of the cortex. And like Bergson, who insists on the unbroken heterogeneity of perceptual images, Freeman says that to grasp choral music, for example, you have to hear the performers modulate together in response to one another. This, he argues, is all part of the chaos complex behavior of vast collections of neurons that shift abruptly and simultaneously from one complex activity pattern to another in response to the smallest inputs. Bergson refers to this as ontological memory, the manner in which multiple dimensions of memory enter into any present perception and constitute it, making it possible for the individual to formulate new ideas and thoughts. So we're not just talking about the origin of life, we're also talking about the origin of thought, of thinking, of ideas. For freedom as well, the chaotic behavior of collections of neurons is what makes it possible to respond to perception at all, and to generate novel activity, and significantly, to have fresh ideas. Freeman concentrates on neurons of the olfactory system, because that's what he studies, and the role of the cortex in synthesizing information. But other researchers, like the neuropsychologist Mark Soames and the neuroscientist Jaap Panksepp in particular, focus on the limbic system, which is becoming increasingly the focus of what I am looking at. The site of consciousness, as the limbic system is the site of consciousness and the source of information passed on to the memory system and eventually to the cortex. So, of course, to discuss all of this in any detail would be a different paper, if not a book. So let me simply conclude that by saying that for neuroscience, as for theoretical biology and philosophy, complexity is now. It's what we must think about when we think about life and when we think about creative activity and when we create concepts. And I urge anyone who sees this to go to Kaufman's website and take a look at his at the full video on the origin of life that Stuart Kaufman produced. It's absolutely lovely. And I was delighted to share just a little bit of it with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Olkowski. That was an incredibly stimulating presentation. We're so lucky to have witnessed that. And Dr. Semmel has asked me to make it very, very clear how grateful we are for you joining us today. Outstanding ideas. Are there
my pleasure. Thank you.
are there any initial questions or comments from anybody in attendance?
Well, this is just general, Dorothea. This is Peg. To tell you how fascinating all this is, I've begun to read a little about this since Samuel asked me to join the advisory board, and this is giving me many other things to follow up on. I'll definitely go back to the Stuart Kaufman. So thank you for stimulating this brain on Friday morning.
Thank you for coming. I know it's early and it's summer.
Any questions about maybe terms or ideas or concepts discussed by Dorothea that maybe you'd want a little more clarification on? Anyone?
I think one of the problems with this is that because there are so many disciplines involved, there's a lot of alien terminology, foreign terminology. It's you know, mathematics, it's dynamical systems, it's neuroscience, it's evolutionary biology, it's philosophy. There are just so many potential entryways into the system. And that's why, you know, when people ask me about it, I often say, well, start by watching Stuart Kaufman's video, because it explains it on the, you know, this really important question on the origin of life and the limitations of the mathematics for providing an account of this, which is not, I mean, I hope I made it clear by starting with John Cassidy. I love the mathematics. I love approaching it. I love that he approached it mathematically and described it mathematically. It made it so much clearer for me. But that the actual issue behind complexity, right, is not it cannot be contained in an algorithm.
So the way we sometimes describe that in our courses is in terms of sort of a critique of reductionism, that we're thinking about ways in which reductivistic models fail to capture complexity accurately. I don't have nearly enough expertise in evolutionary biology to really engage there, but I was so delighted to see toward the end of your presentation you make that pivot toward one of your areas of sort of well-established expertise, which is the philosophy of perception and affectivity. And I did, Dorothy, identify very quickly a passage from your most recent book that I think sort of speaks to this. And maybe if you'd all indulge me, I'll read maybe a paragraph from Dorothea's excellent book, and maybe we can ask her to if you don't mind, Dorothea, comment briefly on the connection between maybe this paragraph and some of the ideas developed in your excellent talk today. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, I will try.
So this is from toward the end of the book, and Dorothea writes, affects are no longer just feelings or affections. They go beyond the strength of those who undergo them. Sensations, percepts, and affects are beings whose validity lies in themselves and exceeds any lived experience. When the brain feels, its sensation bypasses the senses by going directly to the brain as excitation. It is not the sensation or perception of an actor, agent, or subject. The brain gathers and transmits, whether directly or indirectly, all the influences, all the movements of all the points of the material universe, and in doing so, it vibrates. But in the interval, sensation persists as vibration and is not returned and dissipated in action. It is the contraction of all that has come before and has not yet disappeared. I think that's a remarkably beautiful passage there, which seems to be, I think, describing something remarkably complex. It almost, I think, maps directly onto the talk that you just gave, where here sensation seems to be a kind of emergent property that is irreducible to any purely psychological phenomena.
And I'm not trying to eliminate the notion of humans as actors, but I'm trying to point to our neurobiology as opposed to purely physical processes. But affectivity is a question of our sensory motor system and our neural networks and our and our nerve endings in our sensory organs, including our skin, everything, right? And I'm trying to bring the whole person into it, body and soul, so to speak, and to show how complex, right? That this is a complex system, that this cannot be reduced to some physical or material structure, but that what creates even our feelings and our ideas and our existence is the effect of multiple complex systems.
Maybe in much the same way that Kaufman is saying we can't create an equation to model this. We can't
Exactly.
reverse engineer the brain in hopes of finding how that occurs.
And as Bergson points out, the brain is not a thing, it's a switching station, you know? And so, I don't want to overemphasize the brain. I want to point out the extent to which all of our sensory, all aspects of our biology and sensory motor structures are operating here, and what a miraculously complex structure it is.
Any other questions or ideas or comments from anyone?
Thank you for that, Joseph. That was very kind. So perhaps we should wrap it up and let everybody get on with their Friday.
Yes. Thank you again, Dorothea. We really greatly appreciate you, and we appreciate your continued partnership with the UCCS Honors Program. Thank you, Carol, for helping to organize this. And I hope you all have a great couple months here and enjoy your summer.
Great. Thanks.
Yes, you too.
Thank you, Dorothea.
Everybody.
Take care, everybody.